Right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out for Startup Boston Week. My name is Amanda Toomey. I'm one of the organizers for this event. And on my screen, you'll currently see the sessions that are happening right now. You're currently logged in to watch Head in the Clouds. Should the future of data storage be cloud storage? So if this is not where you're supposed to be, navigate toward the bottom of the screen, click on Change Track, and navigate yourself somewhere else to one of those other sessions you're here to view. But again, if it were me, I'm here, I'm watching this session, and I think you should stay put. We have a great panel ahead of us today. But anyhow, while we wait for you guys to all navigate around, just as a reminder, we love questions here at Startup Boston. Our panel is excited for your questions. That's what they're here. They're here for to answer your questions. So put them over in the QA tab on the far right of your screen, and we will get to those at the end of the session. And finally, last but not least, we have an awesome social media competition floating around. In short, basically, you'll want to pay attention to what the speakers are saying today, and then post an awesome quote on social media using the hashtag SBW2021. And then you'll be entered to win one of $500 gift cards to a Black-owned Boston business. So make sure you do that. And that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to our amazing moderator, Ashish Kotari, and I am going to see you soon.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. This is Ashish Kotari, and I am currently working as an associate for Advanced Analytical Consulting Group. So here we are today for the event Head in the Clouds. So we all are crazy about data, I think. Yeah, for sure. That's why we are here looking for some solutions or some different types of, advantages what we can get from the panelists today. So let's not waste more time and introduce our panelists, starting from first with, hi, Vikas, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. This is Vikasha. I am a senior solution architect with AWS. And in my role currently, I help our customers move with help in their journey to cloud, and also help them making the best value of cloud. Super excited to be here.
Yes. Next, we have up here from Paresh Nana.
Hey, hi everyone. Good morning. My name is Paresh. I'm a principal cloud architect at Google Cloud. Similar to Vikas's role in terms of helping customers with their cloud adoption journey, and building out startups in the Boston area. I focus on startups that do healthcare, life sciences, biopharma primarily.
That was nice. Let's have another one from Carl Dinsa.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Firstly, thanks to Startup Boston for the opportunity to join the panel today as well. Kind of career and background in tech and SaaS, recently kind of more focused on the security side, but been in tech for about 25 years. Currently work with Salsify, kind of a leading platform for commerce experience management that facilitates brands, suppliers, and marketplaces to simplify their syndication of products to marketplaces. And prior to that, I worked with a startup that went from 7 folks to about 1,600 globally, was in the SaaS kind of well-being and engagement space. So looking forward to today's discussion.
Thank you. Thank you for your introduction. So let's not waste time and we'll head towards our event. So one of the basic questions we would like someone to answer is, what is clouds and what is its advantages? What about, because how you want to go for this?
Yeah, I can start. So basically the way cloud is defined is it's on-demand IT resources when you need them, and you over internet, and you only pay for what you need. The best analogy I'll give is it's very similar to how you have electricity at home, right? When you turn on the switch, you get the electricity, and then when you turn it off, you don't get it, and you only pay for electricity you consume. Cloud computing is very similar concept, where you're requesting resources when you need it, and you're only paying for the resources that you're using.
Yep. Anyone else want to add up to it?
Yeah,
go
for it, please.
Yeah, I think one additional thing to keep in mind is that in terms of other than paying for resources, the cloud service provider is also doing a lot of maintenance. and management of the infrastructure that supports your workloads that you're building into your products and solutions. So going back to Vikas's electricity example, maintenance of the lines, metering, logging and monitoring all of the things that are going on in this electricity distribution system, that's all handled by the cloud service provider.
Yep. You wanted to add something, Carl?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm probably old enough to remember having servers in a server room with racks and blinking lights and things like that. And some of the scalability for me really is kind of like when we needed to change the disks or increase the size of a disk or increase the performance of a disk, right, we place an order with our vendor, the disks arrive a week or two later, and then we take the server down to replace all the disks, right? You have that in an instant in the cloud. Increasing IOPS, all of those kind of things just become so much more simple if you're using the cloud versus something physical that you have to manage yourself.
That was a good introduction and good start. So as we all know that startups have been developing and the startups have been growing day by day, but the main issue comes at how to divide their cost, what department should go, for how much budget should be done. So here the question comes is, should startups opt for cloud services or they should save it on their own servers and stuff? So we're going to discuss one and get in more depth about this. So one of the most questions, to what extent is cloud storage scalable? And is it cost effective? So Paresh, do you want to go for this?
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah. Obviously, working at Google Cloud, we obviously feel that, look, cloud is scalable. It's cost effective. There's very minimal risk, and we provide a lot of controls and mitigation strategies to make sure that, systems are available, access to your data is always online via strict SLAs. That's that at a very high level, but let's just break each piece or part of that question up. From a scalability perspective, what cloud providers are providing is, number one, a wealth of different types of storage mechanisms to match your workloads profile or your product or services needs, right? That scale is, for small companies, you could theoretically stand up very small clusters. We're talking small disk sizes, and that scales almost infinitely and almost globally. What I mean by infinitely and globally is, as your business grows, as your products and services take off and you get more demand, you can scale your storage accordingly. So the cloud providers are giving you the ability to scale your storage. To Vikas's point earlier, the ability to pay for only what you need. So as a startup, if I'm servicing a market in, say, the New England area, I only need to pay for the storage I need to service that market. But as my product and service goes national, global, my storage needs change, and obviously I'm able to scale up. The inverse is true as well. As you exit an existing market or tackle a new market, you have the ability to scale back. That's what we mean by the elastic nature of storage. So, from a scalability perspective, there's infinite capacity, is what the cloud value solution providers are selling as value. And you can decide how to use that capacity and where to use that capacity. Most startups will start off with a very small footprint in cloud initially. And that footprint, whether it's compute resources, storage resources, will grow as demand for their products and services grow, right? From a cost perspective, the cost of the resources gets cheaper over time in terms of volume of usage. It's a pay-as-you-go model, and just like anything in life, the more you consume or buy, the cheaper it gets, right? So, keep in mind that cloud providers have different tiers of pricing based on, let's use the example of databases or disk storage or even object storage. As you store data, there's a certain price you pay to store the data. From a cost perspective, there's a certain amount of money you pay to access that data, retrieve that data, right? Call that networking charges or egress charges. The key point for every startup is that, the storage costs are comparable, if not better, than any cost you would incur on-prem to begin with, even for a very small footprint. And it only gets cheaper over time as you add more capacity or you start consuming more, right? And then the last piece around risk, that's a huge topic. And I'm sure we're going to get into a lot of this down the road during this webinar. But, risk takes many forms. Things that I can think of: outages. As a small, scrappy startup, you don't want to put your products and services and your customer base at risk in terms of having their inability to access their data or inability to access the service. So, obviously, cloud computing in general, there is some risk associated with outages due to hardware failures, whatever it may be. But that's no different than the risk you would have on-prem anyway, right? To Cal's point, spending Saturday night replacing disks in a server room is no fun, right? And there's many other risks, security compliance considerations. How are you going to secure your data? How are you going to control access to who has that data, whether it's your own development teams, insiders in your organization, your customers, etc. What are your compliance requirements? So those are things. I'm not saying those are risks. I'm just saying those are things that you need to take into consideration to mitigate your risk, right? And then there's external threats. The external threats are things like anomalies and bot farming, malware, as well as denial of service attacks, right? But the net is simply this: from a risk perspective, all cloud service providers will provide adequate security controls and adequate mitigation controls that will allow you as a startup to configure your infrastructure in a way where you can absorb the risk from things going bad. Outages, and an example of the outage one is if there's a distributed denial of service against one of the storage services in the cloud. The cloud infrastructure is resilient and redundant. It's built to absorb that attack. We, as the service provider, give you, the customer, that benefit without you having to do anything, right? We have SLAs in terms of service that give you guarantees in terms of how much downtime we will incur in, let's say, a given year. And we're talking, sometimes 99.9, 99.5, 4 nines, 5 nines availability. It's literally 4 minutes of outage time in an entire calendar year, right? And we obviously try to meet the SLAs, and I'm not saying we do all times, but there are benefits to the customer where if we aren't able to meet SLAs as a cloud service provider, there's incentives built into that to reimburse via credits. But the net is that we, just like you, the customer, we don't want our infrastructure we don't want outages because it impacts your business, and it impacts our business, and it impacts our brand. Anyway, I'll stop there. It's a huge topic. Sorry about that.
Yeah. So that's well mentioned about how cloud storage is scalable, but how much do you agree, because that it is inversely proportional to the volume versus the cost effectiveness?
So when we a lot of points that Paresh mentioned, when we talk with customers about, hey, why, like a lot of enterprise or startup customer, why move to cloud?
Yeah.
The first point they'll always make is cost. With cloud, you are now moving from like that fixed cost model to a variable cost, and some, like what Paresh mentioned, let's say your demand increases over time, you're providing more value to customer, your cost will proportionally increase. And then let's say when you're starting a new idea and it doesn't work out, right? You're experimenting, you're trying it out, it's not working out. You can always scale back and scale it down to null, and you're not paying for the resources that you're not using, as compared to what you would do in the past on-prem, where whenever you're starting a new idea, you would need that capital expense from VC to invest on, like, hey, I need these many servers and I want to invest there. And then if that idea doesn't work out, then you're asking for more funding. So that's not the case with the cloud. So that's the first thing. And some of the other question that Ashish, you asked, is around like, what's the net benefit around cost, or like what's the
Cost effective.
so like what we see in the industry there, it's hard to believe a reason where you wouldn't start with the cloud and you would start with something else, just because the scalability, some of the other things that Paresh mentioned around like economies of scale, right? Even with the variable factor, right, in terms of the infrastructure resources that you would pay, with all the cloud providers, you get that advantage of economies of scale. And what that translates into is the cost, where because they're growing, because they're scaling, there are a lot of automation and things that are built in which then translate into cost saving and which is then transferred to the customers.
Oh, that's nice. There's one more question that is very important. So the most important question for startup is it okay to store like personal identifiable information or personal credit card information data on the cloud when they are starting a new company because they are not yet gained the trust of the customers or they are just gaining or in the process of it. So whenever whenever a new service is being joined by a customer, so they always have a doubt in their mind how this will be saved and how much security I'm getting on my information. So what do you think about this, Carl?
I think the simple answer is yes, but it comes with responsibility, right? To Paresh's point earlier, cloud providers have this shared security responsibility that you need to understand where you kind of fall into that. And it's to some extent, it's the same as you would have with physical infrastructure, right? Regardless of where that data is, it's PII, it's PCI data, the controls need to be applied, right? It's the important things that you want to make sure you've got adequate network protections in place. You're doing credential management effectively. You're using like patching hygiene, all of those kind of things that protect the infrastructure that's housing and storing that information. And I think the cloud simplifies a lot of this, whereas I think you'd need a fairly large team and deep skill sets to be able to deploy some of these things yourself. If you went for the option of deploying physical hardware, even just kind of from the physical security of all of this hardware, whereas the cloud kind of abstracts much of that away from you. You could also rely on services. So there are services that actually overlay on some of the cloud providers, which will build you a HIPAA compliant, PCI compliant kind of ecosystem that you work within, right? So you get a template that as a startup is some level invaluable, right? You're not having to invest and bring in like long-term resources that that have the skill sets to kind of deploy these things, where you can just bring in an extra service provider that works well with that cloud provider. They've got a history, they understand how the ecosystem works, they know which of those services are PCI compliant, which of those services are HIPAA compliant, and then you can build within that that framework that the cloud provider is kind of given you.
So one of the question arises is, so when we talk about security, so basically in the beginning, if the startup decides to go and save this kind of information on their personal servers, so what do you think, how much risk is involved and how much cost it will take to secure those information for the startups if not on cloud?
I think it's the risk is probably similar, right? I think that from a security perspective, knowing where your data is the key, right? So you can deploy cloud or you can deploy physical. You have to know in either circumstance where your data resides and how far that's kind of moved from either core systems onto kind of these external systems or devices. The controls, I think, map across both of those. I think it's easier within the cloud because now you have a box, right? It lives somewhere, and while within that ecosystem you may be moving between services, you're not kind of worried about these physical hosts that you now have to manage alongside all of the security requirements. And I think it's as a startup, it's probably easier to scale the controls in an environment where a lot of those dials are built for you, right? So if you want to deploy a service that's compliant with X framework, well, here's the list of services from any of the cloud providers that will support you with that. Those are the services you can choose from, and they're kind of already pre-built, right? If you're using a key management system, then you want to have encryption keys and you manage the control around those things, right? How do you like in-source you can in-source a physical kind of hardware security module that manages those keys for you, but being able to leverage a cloud environment where you can actually have independent attestations to the controls around that, around the security controls of that platform is something that you would be more difficult and also expensive to have internally.
So yeah, you go ahead.
Sorry, just to add to what Cal's saying, I think startups should remember that, different cloud products and services have different levels of responsibility for the customer as it relates to the controls that need to be implemented. What I mean by that is, on one end of the spectrum, you have self-managed, just traditional infrastructure as a service. Hey, I'm going to, get a box from AWS, Azure, Google, and I'm going to put my own database on that box. I'm going to put access control. I control the access to the box. I control, firewalling to that box on the network, etc. And then the other end of the spectrum, you've got these fully managed platform services. In some cases, they fully managed and self-service. As you go from left to right, your level of responsibility on the customer goes down from an infrastructure perspective, from securing your infrastructure, but goes up from an access control perspective. What we mean by that is securing the data and who accesses that data. So just keep that in mind, that you have the flexibility of doing self-managed services and infrastructure and products and solutions in the cloud. But you also inherit what you would traditionally on-prem as well. You inherit the responsibility of implementing the controls. We give you the ability to implement the control, but it's up to you to implement the control. It's not configured, so other than a few standard controls, they're not pre-configured for you out of the box. But to Cal's point, there are a lot of companies and overlay platforms that do that for you in an automated way, right? The other option, is to go fully serverless, fully managed by the cloud provider. They'll take care of everything: patching, vulnerability scanning, security updates, and they leave you to basically put data into the storage system and control who accesses that data in a secure way. All of the other security and controls that need to be implemented are done for you because it's a fully managed service that you consume.
So following with up the conversation that you are opting in, like either startups can go full hybrid or not. So what the question arises, so is it a good choice to have a hybrid model, or is it a good choice to select either of them, like a full cloud service or a full service from themselves?
Yeah, and I can
Yeah,
start
go
with
for it.
that. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, so a lot of when we see the market, 10 years from now, we're seeing a great momentum around like moving into the cloud. But what we also see is there are still some workloads that require lower latency or local data processing. For example, in a factory or edge devices, right, where you need to process the data locally. And for that kind of setup, we still see customers adopting two things, which is one, you have edge devices, which are pretty close to the application, which requires lower latency, but then you're doing a lot of analytics and intelligent processing and so on onto the cloud.
Anyone want to add on to it? Like a hybrid model, what would be your suggestions to a startup, like going for a hybrid model or not?
It would depend a lot on, the other consideration, in addition to the characteristics of the workload that Vikas brought up around latency and how, keeping the processing and the data close together. That's certainly one consideration. Another is speed. It's something a lot of startups want. They want to be, they gritty. They want to move quickly. They want to ship as much features as they can, right? So you got to measure this. Well, if in a hybrid model, what is going to be the expectation around speed for my developers in terms of how quickly they can ship product, keeping in mind that you have dependencies on other things, lead times for procuring hardware or laying down network pipe, whatever it may be, right? So I'm not saying, I'm just using that example of speed to say that, you got to measure, do I go all in cloud on day one? Mm-hmm. That may be a good option if shipping very quickly. You want to prototype and get to market very quickly. You want to move your product through its life cycle very quickly. We see hybrid primarily in enterprise use cases where customers are very, they mature around their business processes, and they're more concerned around things like business continuity and disaster recovery. They will sometimes choose to go hybrid model. We will keep some stuff in the cloud or on-prem. We may burst, or fail over to the cloud, or vice versa, right? But I think for startups, you got to measure that speed and scale part of the equation against risk and the profile of your workloads as to determining where do you fit. Am I hybrid? Am I all in cloud? Am I all on-prem?
You want to add something on it, Carl?
Yeah, I think agree with what both Paresh and Vikas have said there, but I think one of the things for me is that the skill set for physical infrastructure is different to kind of what you might have in your DevOps team these days, your engineering team, right? You've got to be managing firewalls and servers and all of these things, and it's a different kind of group of folks that would manage that in some organizations, right? And having that that kind of abstracted away from you allows you to kind of simplify maybe your bootstrapping, right? You're kind of this gritty startup. You want to be able to pivot quickly. You want to be able to change direction. The capital expenditure of bringing systems on-prem is fairly significant, right? And if you move to that model of, all right, now this actually works, we want to make sure that this is redundant and scalable, right? If you're in a cloud environment, you check a box, and now you've got a multi-region database that is kind of backed up for you on an on-prem scenario. How would you kind of manage that? So having that ability to pivot back and forth is probably a good way to manage it if your business model requires that. But I think ultimately it's up to the founders to do what's right for their product, right? They need to understand what are we trying to achieve here? What's really important to us in terms of the goals for maybe speed to market, or maybe we want to build something more resilient ahead of time, right? And what are the security controls and the considerations that also go alongside some of those. But I think to sit on the fence on this one, I think it's do what's right for your startup.
Okay. Yeah, no, that sounds fair. So one more thing, guys. If anyone has any questions, they can post it in Q&A, and then we can take up questions too in between if there's some possibility. So yeah, so now we see that it's their choice, like going on a hybrid model or a full cloud. So one of the question arises for the startups, like if they go on cloud and there's a data breach, so how the cloud services will tackle that, versus what do you think, how difficult it is to tackle for a startup such a thing on their own?
So I can start, and then I'll ask Paresh and Carl to add as well. When it comes to data breach, right? So first, when we talk about data breach, there are a couple of things. One is, how do you prevent data breach from happening, right? And when the data breach happen, what are some of the measures you have to tackle that, right? And then post steps, what can you do after that? So in terms, I'll start with the preventive measures. In terms of what cloud providers provide us are some of the tools and capabilities to prevent you. So like some of the things we already discussed around security, which is patching and making sure your data is encrypted, making sure your data is backed up. So in case you have some events like ransomware, you are able to recover from that. So those are some security hygiene that cloud providers provide, and then the next step is you have all the security controls, but then things still happen. So how do you detect if there is an event happening? And for that, there are a lot of logs and audit tools that a lot of that cloud providers provide, which you can quickly use to identify if there are breaches or not. And then once you detect this, then the next thing is to take action, right? So like how do you like, and some of the things that Paresh mentioned earlier around DDoS and some of those, how do you tackle that? So like DDoS, when you have a DDoS attack and you need more infrastructure at least to handle that for time being while you prevent that attack. So for that, you have that elasticity available where you can spin up more resources. And then the other things around like backups. How do you recover when there is a disaster? How do you recover from the backup quickly? Depending on your SLAs, what are some of the measures? Like, do you have active where you have to your application is a highly available application and requires active configuration where you want to make sure that your infrastructure is running on like 2 regions or to geographic location and are quickly recovering as soon as there is outage in like a very short time frame, or versus like you're okay to your workload is not as critical and you're okay to wait for a little bit, and that because when you're doing active there's a little bit cost that you're paying as well. So with that, you have a couple of options and choices based on the workload. So that allows you to build this end-to-end architecture to to deal with the breaches.
So do you guys think that it is an advantage at such situation to be on cloud services?
I think you get, as Vikas mentioned there, you get a lot of the table stakes kind of requirements for being able to respond to or mitigate against and also respond to attacks or breaches within that cloud environment. But to a large extent, kind of just if you read much of the kind of the breaches that occur, right, it's the same stuff that was that is causing the breaches as was probably causing breaches 10 years ago before cloud was prevalent, right? It's the hygiene that we're doing around that environment, right? I think the responsibility is as founders or kind of the managers of this infrastructure is that we need to be patching, right? We need to be aware of the firewall rules we're enabling and all of these kind of things. We had a vendor that we worked with once that spun up a whole new platform to kind of intake appointment requests and left the old one online, right? Just didn't patch it for some period of time. SQL injection against a PHP application, download the SQL database, right? It's those kind of things that lead to breaches. It's as opposed to just being in the cloud itself, right? The cloud is as secure as anything else, as long as you're ensuring that you're kind of taking the responsibility that you own as kind of the owner of that tenant to do the right things around it. So I think, yeah, I don't think there's anything specific around cloud that makes it less secure. I think as a table stakes, you probably get more, right? You're not having to build out logging systems. You're not having to build out a brand new WAF, right? All of these things are available in cloud providers or multi-cloud providers if you wanted to overlay a few, but you have to do the basics right as well.
Yeah, it's a shared responsibility model. You as a customer, or as a founder in a startup or a development team in a startup org, you have to implement the controls. The cloud providers will give you the ability to turn knobs and dials to implement a control, but you've got to make that decision. And a great example recently in the recent past, there were a few breaches where there was customer data being leaked to the worldwide internet from cloud storage providers. Just using that as an example, and it turns out that the access control that the customer had used was inadequate. They had set public ACLs, access control lists, where the cloud provider best practices, look, don't use public ACLs, turn that feature off. It's default off anyway. Use identity and access management as a mechanism to control how you access these buckets and who you share the data with. Who you share those buckets with in terms of what the data they contain. And what happened in this case was, an example of a customer putting a public ACL on a bucket, and by its nature, anyone was able to, any user worldwide was able to then get into that bucket and look at that data, right? So I'm not saying it's not a point game. This is not about pointing blame. The point is simply, the cloud providers will give you controls that are pre-built, that have a lot of features and capabilities. Turn those on, use them. Don't treat the cloud in any different way as you would treat your on-prem gear. When you build out your own, closet or rack of servers, you do take time to harden and security controls in place. It's no different in the cloud.
So yeah, we discussed a lot of things about this. So we'll just ask if anyone has any questions joining in. So if you have any questions, please post it or you can ask. Okay, we'll take up if anything comes up. So wrapping up, what would be your, so let's compare all the disadvantages, advantages. So what would be the last suggestion for you that do startups should go for cloud services in the beginning itself? So that's how they would proceed or not.
I think on this, it goes back to do what's right for your startup, right? I think the days of needing to invest heavily in infrastructure, right? So buying a server, waiting for it to arrive, and I remember kind of building some myself, right? You wait for the hardware to arrive, significant capital investment to do that. Startups pivot. How many startups these days end up being the company that the founders envisaged like years earlier, right? There's multiple pivots that you get to before you find the product market fit and end up in the space that you think is the one for your business and the one that you're successful in. The investment, to Vikas's point earlier, right? Investing in physical infrastructure, which may or may not be useful to you in your future state. Also scaling, right? So you probably will need to scale, hopefully, if everyone's successful, right? But you're having to invest in oversized infrastructure to make sure that you can grow to some period of time. Otherwise, you're waiting for these new hardware to ship and all of these kind of things, right? In the cloud, you have that, right? You have that scaling ability almost kind of instantaneously. You can automate some of it as well, right? If you've got kind of the features set up to watch your load, right? Hey, I'm hitting X capacity, spin up some new hosts, drop them in the load balancer. Now you've got capacity there. Your databases can grow in a similar fashion, right? It's just something that as a startup that's looking to scale, maybe being agile, pivoting maybe frequently, having the ability to throw something away and start fresh is something that I think is really valuable.
Yeah, I'll add to Carl's point, when you're starting up the business, one thing you should think about is what will make a key difference in terms of value and services we are providing. So if your core business is not around building infrastructure and services, because these are the things that you would definitely need, then I would really consider cloud providers, because you don't want to do that undifferentiated heavy lifting. But if your core infrastructure, if your core value that you're providing to the customer is otherwise, then I would think about other options.
And just final word to add to what Vikas said. The other thing to keep in mind is that the cloud providers will give you, our own platforms morph over time. We deliver new features and capabilities. We get better. Our cost ratios go down. We look at the cost of cloud storage a decade ago versus today. It's every year we I'm not saying every year, but I'm just using an example like that factors of a tenth of the cost, or we move the decimal 1 point over. Today you can get a gig worth of online storage with unlimited read write anywhere in the world for 0.0003 cents per hour, right? A decade from now it could be 4 zeros. That's so there's economies of scale there, right? That's the first thing. And the second thing is, as we morph and build new key features and capabilities, Vikas brought a very key point up early on, which is, if your business is edge processing, you keep your data close to your processing and compute, and you don't have this footprint you don't have to go out to the wide world. Hey, I don't have customers in Australia and Asia that I need to serve. That might make a different decision in terms of how you architect for that, right? But as cloud providers, we also acknowledge that. We understand that, look, there are workloads that are not going to be today going to cloud. So guess what? We are starting to think about long-term, how do we morph our cloud infrastructure where we can take our compute to where the data is or where the customer is, right? So you'll see from AWS, Microsoft, Google, and a lot of the other hyperscale providers worldwide, this concept now of edge computing. You can actually do AI and ML on the edge from a service that a cloud provider is giving you. It wasn't something someone would have even thought of 5 years or 3 years ago. So the key point is that these cloud services morph and change over time. All the benefits you get in terms of cost and scale, those will continue to be there. But we also acknowledge that we want to fit as many of the use cases for our customers going down the road. Even those customers that have very business critical, high performance needs on the edge or close to their data or close to their customers.
Yeah. Saying that, that was a really good session and helpful for everyone. We answered almost everything from how the startup should think about going on cloud or a hybrid model, advantages, disadvantages, the risk involved. Sorry for that. So yeah, I think that was a pretty much informational, very you guys provided a good insights about how cloud services can help a startup move ahead in there, and how much it can cost also for them to start their own server, and like Carl said, mentioned bringing in the hardware, it will take time and stuff. So yeah, I think this should provide a lot of information to the startups. I would really thank you guys for joining in us today, and it was a very overwhelming section for us to gain knowledge from you guys. Thank you so much for joining in, guys.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you,
Pleasure
Ashish.
being here.
Thank you, everyone.
We'll just wait for a minute or two. If we have any questions, then we can take up and then we can log off. Till the time you guys can discuss if there's anything. Okay. I think that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining in, guys, and I really appreciate your time to join. This was it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.